A fox knows many things, but a hedgehog knows one important thing. It's one important thing. It's one important thing.
Welcome to the Spiritual Hedgehog podcast, where we explore the role philosophy and faith play in your daily life. Here are your hosts, Ira Gardner and Pastor Eric Dahl.
You want to talk about being a liberal?
Well, actually, Eric, I want to ask you, in your expert opinion, and actually, I'm going to show you a photo that I made at a grocery store. I made it 2 years ago, but it's appropriate now, still very, very relevant. I'm fascinated with how imagery communicates culture, and how I didn't place this. This was exactly the way I found it. And we're entering into the hype and season of a presidential election. And so I would like to ask you, who would Jesus vote for?
Yeah. oh, putting me on the spot there.
I am.
Wow. No, it's funny because I will make it quite obvious who I think Jesus would vote for. Well, maybe I need to think this through a second, because if you think about the scriptural references of, for instance, kind of coming around the corner, just happened is, they show Jesus a coin and say, basically asking the question, do we pay tax? Should we be paying taxes to the emperor? And Jesus says, show me the coin. And whose picture's on the coin? Well, give unto Caesar what's due Caesar. And then on another part, Jesus talks about how God will work through all leaders. So there's this interesting dichotomy. I'm starting it out there. Who do I think Jesus would vote for? I think sometimes I think Jesus is sort of beyond the whole voting game, but I think, I suppose the related question.
I'm really
I think Jesus.
You.
I know. Well, but I don't mind, because I bring this up. I bring this up to my libertarian friends, and I bring it up to some of my conservative Republican friends. Do they think Jesus is more a Democrat or a Republican? And do we think Jesus is more a communist, or do we think Jesus is would be more into democracy? Do we think so? You start to place these, and again, the problem is we're putting these into dualistic forms again, right? We're putting it into these either or categories, and I do that, and obviously by asking those questions, I do that. So who do I think Jesus vote for? I think it's a non-starter in some ways, because it doesn't do me any good to say Jesus is going to follow the way I believe, and he's not going to vote for Trump. He's going to vote for anybody but Trump, is, kind of the way. And yet I get a feed from my cousin that talks about how Trump, while not being a good human being, is being used by God to further, so you see these outlandish statements that are, to me, outlandish, and yet I'm sure my statements would seem just as outlandish. So it's, especially as we're going to wrap now into the hypersensitivity of the political season, and people are going to get more upset than I think in the history of my lifetime in politics. It's a fair question. So the same question right back to you. You show that caption, and for those who didn't see it, it shows kind of these gun rights and thing about an AR-15, and then who do people say that Jesus is, all sitting right next to each other.
You see a portrait, the classic image of Jesus, who looks a lot like Ashton Kutcher.
Yeah.
And you see to the left a AR-15 magazine with machine gun parts, and to the left of that you see a magazine called Personal Defense World, where a woman is kneeing the head of an attacker. So it's a very aggressive, very interesting juxtaposition, if you will, of what is historically called, the Lamb of God with the violence of war happening simultaneously. And it's an interesting statement about how politics and personal philosophies are woven into religion, and there are fundamentalists and evangelical groups that are see themselves as in alignment with God while joining a militia and appearing with weapons in hand in public events. Yeah. And then you have other Christians that would say, oh no, my God is a loving, passive God, turn the other cheek. And so really, I thought it was an interesting starter, but ultimately what I was curious about and where I've been going in my thoughts the last couple of weeks really is, what is this we're really fighting about in media and in politics? And ultimately, it's about an argument about what does it mean to be liberal. And what's interesting about it is in looking at, and I'll just tell you where this came from. It was kind of a miraculous occurrence. I literally shot out of bed one morning from a dream state where I had this incredible dream where this African-American man was teaching photography, but he was quoting Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America. And it was the most amazing symbolism of mixing in what's happening with Black Lives Matter, what's happening with the election, and these quotes that when I just started reviewing, I hadn't thought about Democracy in America in a long time, but some of the quotes that come from that book is, for example, I don't know if the people of the United States would vote for superior men if they ran for office, but there can be no doubt that such men do not run. What I found was just looking at the origins of the word liberal. Uh-huh. And what I also found in studying a little bit about Tocqueville, who came from France, mm-hmm. and made some interesting observations about America, in that in France, there were actually laws that prohibited inheritance being passed down to multiple children, that it had to go to the eldest because it was designed to hold estates together. And so there was less need to work at preserving or growing wealth. There was a status system, so to speak. And so it was considered rather garish to be always pursuing markets and advertising and sales, et cetera. Whereas in America, we actually had more churning of money into the economy through the distribution of wealth being inherited different ways. But what was interesting is apparently there's two different approaches to liberalism. And liberal is really looking at liberty. Liberty is in personal freedom. Yeah. And so you get the British side of things, which is tied very much to classical liberalism, which is tied to property rights. Everything's about property and free markets, and even ourselves is treated as property, and that our labor is treated as a property to be negotiated with. As opposed to what one article I was reading was talking about, the result of the French Revolution was more of a social justice approach to liberty, which basically the British side and really a lot of what conservative Republican ideology is falling back to is this idea of less government, no intervention. Mm-hmm. The other side is more of a social justice, which says, well, wait, there's a role for government to protect individual liberty. Right. And so we had this kind of culture clash in America, if you will, because you had extreme wealth, you had the Rockefellers, you essentially had the oligarchs of this country that were the owners of property, and they owned the labor, and we had workers, the working class, working 7 days a week. And it wasn't until you had some revolution, if you think about union organizing, et cetera, that started looking at workers' rights and wages and that sort of thing. So you had government breaking up monopolies, antitrust laws, and you had a kind of a more of a progressive agenda of liberty being protected through government intervention. And that became a little bit more like what we would consider the Democratic Party today, even though I think there was kind of a shift there at one point.
Yeah.
Dixie Cracks were more like the classical liberals, but now it's kind of flip-flop. And then you have neoliberalism, which moved to property and wealth being accumulated based on a global economy. And you see the results of that is the extraction of wealth from countries, and colonialism probably contributed to this as well. But you see an extraction of wealth with the locals being left without wealth, and then it migrates, and then you end up with these boom towns that are dead. You end up with ghost towns. So in my realm, there is a Brazilian photographer who started out with a PhD in economics, who ended up going to Africa and witnessing what was happening on the coffee plantations. His wife gave him a camera. He took the camera to photograph, but he was so moved by what he saw, the labor conditions, et cetera, that he became a full-time photographer and produced a book called Workers, and another one called Migrations, that was looking at the impact of globalization on working conditions and the disruption of populations of people by this movement of wealth. And so it seems to me like we're debating liberty and debating where's government come in.
Well, and that's exactly probably what we should be debating, and debating it openly, but it gets couched in all this, in my mind, in all this sort of false, these false narratives, these false debates that, so you go right to the extremes, real, and in the argument, so you pro-life or pro-choice, and very few people would, want to say, and then if you're pro-life, right, you're categorized as an ultra conservative religious fanatic, and if you're pro-choice, you want to kill babies, and we polarize instead of realizing that most of us just know that it's a social question that has much deeper implications for those who are struggling with those questions, who are having to deal with very real issues. And so it gets separated into an extreme instead of saying, what are those personal liberties that we're really talking about? What is the dialogue that really needs to be taking place here? And how do we respect one another while we're having that, instead of categorically saying this person thinks this and that person thinks this? So liberalism, allow me to circle back for a second.
Absolutely.
And just kind of thinking about this. I was interested, as a history major and studying John Locke and studying, some of these folks, and then really seeing, and to think that classic liberalism really was about small government, and really, keep government really had 4 or 5 specific roles. Well, a military role to protect the country, some of those things. And so you kept government small. Well, that shifted as classical liberalism moved into a more social liberalism. The piece got picked up, and if you would have asked me without a history degree who believes in small government throughout history, I would have said conservatism. Conservatives want to keep people out, and I think it does hold true, right? You see, part of the thing where I would say our current president is very not very conservative and or maybe it's even more libertarian, is taken out all the places where government intervenes in business.
Here's the thing about that. Here's the thing about that.
Yeah.
The reason government ended up interfering with business in the first place is because you had a combination of monopolies that were depressing social mobility and wealth and fair trade and workers' rights and we didn't have people were going to debtor's prison practically, right? But then we also had environment degradation, which was also creating medical calamities that forced us to say, well, wait a sec. Corporations by themselves, left to themselves in a profit-driven motive only, unchecked, will end up making the planet inhospitable. And the needs of the many had to outweigh the needs of the few in some instances. And that's an ethical dilemma that we have. And which gets me to this idea of why we need philosophy. We need philosophy to be able to use it as a lens by which we make choices. And that's where I find interesting, Christian philosophy, if you will, not just a theology, but if you have a philosophy of stewardship, of caring for the less able or those in need, then you're going to want to make some choices. And what's interesting is, a lot of private organizations, churches do a lot of social work. Lutheran Services does a lot of work and a lot of good work. So the question becomes, how much government intervention, what size of it, as opposed to having no regulation or it's a middle ground, but we're not having that debate.
Right.
We're not debating it based on a philosophy. We're debating it based upon a competitive win at all cost.
Right. And it's emotion, right. And we're having it on an emotional level rather than being able to step back and have it on a thoughtful level, which, and it's not to say emotions are bad in that mix, but it means if we start with the emotional, and we're in the emotional, we're reacting emotionally right away. That's where we get into the fight or flight. That's where we get it at the win at all costs. As I've said before, one of the things I say at all, when I'm doing marriage counseling, and I'll say it just about to every couple, is if you are entering into this discussion trying to win an argument, you've both already lost. So it's philosophically, if it's the same sort of matter. If we're entering into these debates, just trying to prove the other wrong and myself right, we're in trouble. If we're entering into the conversation to say what's the best from an ethical standpoint for the greatest number of people, both in the short term, and then also let's look at it in the long term, because they may not be equal. That it changes the conversation. So for instance, I guess I would say let's look at the economic kind of debate we're having. Short term, just about any business person would say, President Trump has done and speaking from a business and talking to a lot of business people, has done a really good job of promoting, getting money into the businesses again, getting things flowing until the pandemic hit. And I want to say, okay, we could still argue that, but I said, but there's a deeper question about the long-term health of what's going on again, because when you take regulations away, and when you take checks and balances away, and when you start doing that stuff, you might have a short-term growth, but long-term, are we asking those questions of where this is going to lead into some very difficult situations, not only for our country, but for the world that we're living in. So yeah, I guess, it's interesting in thinking about those questions. How do we get back into the conversation? Just what are our ideals?
On the classical liberalism, or what we now call conservative, it's about it's a philosophy of self-reliance.
Mm-hmm.
And on the social justice new liberalism, which is becoming this polemic, negative connotation, the social justice democratic approach to, or the progressive approach, is saying we need to care for each other. We need a minimum basic care, whether it's a health care system for all, social welfare programs, etc. And so I go back to the original question of who would Jesus vote for? Well, on the one hand, he talks about preferring to teach people how to fish, self-reliance in some respects, right? On the other hand, he's breaking bread and making food and go to the masses, and is also healing and caring for people along the way. So I don't think it's a one or the other. I think we need both. But that the challenge we have is that since World War II in particular, when we look at mass media, of particularly television, it's interesting if you go back and look at the Nixon-Kennedy debates. If you listen to it on the radio, you thought Nixon won. If you watched it on the TV, you thought Kennedy won because he looked healthier, he looked younger, even though ironically he had major health problems, and Nixon just was a little sick from some food,
Yeah.
And so the medium that won out was the visual media. And so you think about what's going on now with the symbolism, with the flag, patriotism, religion, and you think about this idea of conservative values, which, self-reliance sounds good,
Mm-hmm.
less government, less tax, sounds good, but the media has caused the soundbite to be formed. And so what happened is, after World War II, the United States Senate actually hired Sigmund Freud's nephew to study how the Nazi Party was able to use propaganda to move masses of people. And what happened out of that is we had the public relations industry born, and that has funded incredible research, which now we're using functional MRIs to where I can know what your reaction is going to be to symbols I put in front of you, images I put in front of you, almost guaranteed. There are about 700 symbols that are guaranteed to draw out certain responses. And then when you combine that with what we know about exposure effect and normalizing things, and even the whole idea of kidnapper can be become in love with their the person that kidnapped them. So much of our media and our technology in particular is designed to act on our subconscious, that what's happening, in my opinion, this is just an opinion at this point, is the psychological impact of anchoring. It's called anchoring bias.
Yeah.
Where the first thing is the first piece of information, and the one you hear the most is going to be what you believe, and you're just gonna in tumultuous times you're gonna just go back to that initial. And so what happens is we go back to this. We're living in a time where mass layoffs happen, factories move. It used to be you could work for 30 years and get a guaranteed pension. Pensions are gone. Pensions that are still here are failing and being bailed out by government. And now the average worker changes jobs every 5 years. And they now have a 401k where they're subject to the gains and losses of a marketplace that they have very little understanding of. I would guess. I have very little understanding of it.
Yep.
And so there's a lot of instability in the population, which tends to make it easier to stimulate people in a particular direction.
So classic example of this, again, this is my cousin in Florida, who will remain unnamed right now. But he's also very thoughtful. But he said, he just posed the question on Facebook. If you see a flag in front of a house, what political party do you think? If you see an American flag in front of a house or in the back of a truck, what political party do you think that person is? Okay. Mm-hmm. And a couple of people, responded pretty quickly, come on, he goes, you took the bait, right? And why? I didn't say which one I thought, and then, my thought was, well, if you see a Confederate flag in the back of a truck, which party do you think they are? And so there's the sense, right, that patriotism has been wrapped into a flag that's been wrapped into where I know, I purposefully, I wanted my mom's flag. But instead of having a conversation of what we think patriotism means, we have resorted to these images of this is patriotic, right? So one of the ways I express that is you will not see me put my hand over my heart for the national anthem. And you might see me do it if I see the cross process in front of me, because to me, I want to say my ultimate allegiance, even though I would say I'm very patriotic, but my ultimate allegiance is not to the flag. It's to my God and the one I worship. I bring these, but it gets back exactly to kind of what you're saying, is that there's this, you can show an image and through probably what's happened since World War II and with propaganda and how things and the deeper understanding, instead of being used for good, I think so often propaganda, because propaganda can be used for good, but so often now it is being used to divide or to just get people on one side.
I think the antidote to blind propaganda and to overt manipulation and an overt simplification, I think the problem with the polemics of our time is it's an gross oversimplification. It's black and white, good or bad.
Yep.
And so I think that's where you need philosophy, and you need the ability to have a respectful debate that is grounded in ethics and grounded in a framework of trying to define a course that balances those two elements together. That really sometimes no action is the best action, because you're not going to make a mistake per se, and maybe it's time to just slow down and have some conversations about, well, let's talk about self-reliance. Let's talk about the needs of the many, and talk about immigration from a compassionate perspective. Let's, for example, I was just reading an interesting article in the Atlantic that came out this week about a fungus that has migrated into the coffee plantations, and that many of the, you remember the immigrant march north to the American border, many of those people were coffee workers from Guatemala that were out of work because the fungus had wiped out the crops. And it was fascinating to learn that the real reason that the British Empire became more tea drinkers is because the origins of this fungus wiped out all their British colony coffee plantations, and they grew tea instead. So, we need history, we need philosophy, yep, and we need ethical and meaningful debate And I feel blessed that I'm able to do that. I mean, I have a neighbor who we get along great. We do not see politics the same way, but we have really good debates and really good conversations that are very, very, very respectful. Mm-hmm. I'll tell you a funny story. You mentioned about the flag and what would you assume, etc. My motorcycle broke down in Central Oregon in the desert. And I won't tell the whole story, but I'll just tell you that the person that rescued me, who became my hero, was a guy that showed up with a Hummer with a bunch of military stickers on it, a flag, and a trailer, who put me up for the night, towed trailered my motorcycle 90 miles to the nearest repair shop, showed me his man cave, which included a wall full of automatic weapons and flags. And when we were sitting on his deck, he and his wife both said, "We have something we need to tell you, and we hope you're okay with it." And I said, "What's that?" He says, "We're not conservative." What do you mean? We're not conservative. We believe we're voting Democratic. And like, if I had judged that book by its cover,
yeah, I
would have made some false assumptions.
Yeah.
And ended up having this incredible conversation. And it just, we need to be able to look past the cover, and we need to look at each other past the labels. Yeah. And I think we need wisdom and compassion rather than rhetoric and argument.
What can lead us into that? So back to democracy in America, right? Alex did. Mm-hmm. He's one of the things, that he noticed at the time was part of what he saw as the strength of the United States democracy was the growth that was going on between these three kind of major sections: the government, sort of the business, but then what he also called that civil sector. And what we've seen now is billions of dollars into the government and billions of dollars into business, but the civic voice has gotten so weak and been co-opted, right? So special interests and all those things are co-opted by both business and government in a sense. And what you're talking about, to me, is really the truth that de Tocqueville was talking about, back in the 1800s or 1800s, was, this idea is if we lose that civic voice and that civic discourse and that as a major player, democracy will be in trouble, because you don't have that corrective. And that third voice, it becomes this polarization that's happened. And in some ways, it is, I think, what we are seeing. And so how do we get that, as you're calling it, the philosophical voice back into the conversation? And I think it's a fair question. And I think it probably starts with us not to just throw up our hands now in this voting section, but so when my cousin, again, throws out a question of really trying to understand, because he will come to this, of besides your dislike of Trump, what are you really standing for? Democrats or progressives, or what's become a dirty word for conservatives as liberals, which is interesting because I don't see conservative as quite having the negative connotation that liberal does for some of our culture. And I would like to say, the reason I vote Democrat at this point is I think they are looking more at the question of how do we promote power with rather than power over? How do we take care of the least of these, which to me is part of my faith background. And then my list goes on from there to say, and this is upholding, and what I see is this disenfranchisement of taking care of the least, from mental health to people with disabilities to creation, which I would also say in some ways is the least, all of those questions. but I'm never allowed to really feel like I can have that conversation, because I think there is a response that comes from them. At least it used to be. It used to be that we think taking care of the poor, that there are better ways to do it than just throwing money right at the entitlement programs. There is an argument there. And I won't just totally dismiss it, because obviously I think you'd be hard pressed to find anyone that would say our welfare system's perfect. But the question I'll always ask is, if you're going to take it away, what are we going to replace it with? And it seems to me that's what we should be talking about. If you're going to take, okay, you don't like the Obamacare, all right, then instead of saying, for Democrats to say we have to hold on to this 100%, and Republicans say we've got to dismiss this 100%, the question is, what is the system we want that's going to be best? And when it's important to me that we are taking care of those who do not have, or that have mental illness and that are on the streets, so those become important questions. The other thing is, what's really interesting to me is I don't really hear Democrat or Republican talking about, I moved to Eugene, Oregon, this huge homeless problem that are problem, yes, because it affects people in so many different ways, from feeling safe to having warm places, to stay, to having not just enough food, but decent food and healthy food, and all these different aspects. It's a problem that's been with society forever, but it's just like, it feels like we're taking a 20-year break from addressing it.
I think part of the challenge is these are complex problems, and they don't, a simple solution based on a slogan isn't going to solve it.
Right.
For example, you bring up homelessness, well, and you bring up issues like the abortion issue, et cetera. Healthcare, early childhood education, for every dollar spent on early childhood education, it saves $5 in future social welfare and incarceration costs. So where are we putting our money? And yet the reality is, early childhood workers are some of the lowest paid workers in our society. And yet they do perhaps the most important work. Again, thinking through a philosophical lens, and also looking at trying to tease out all the strings that are woven together into the problem, you're going to have to find bipartisan solutions that address a little bit more than just the effect. We have to look at the interrelated causes, and then we have to be okay with experimentation and failure. We have to say, okay, we tried this, didn't work. What's the next best idea that we come up with? As a culture, have some rubric for assessing whether or not we're moving in the right direction, and not just through this sort of yelling at each other. And you can't accomplish that in a Twitter feed. You can't accomplish that in a meme.
I wonder. I mean, I'm curious. Do you think people would agree more or less with the statement, or with the idea of, or agree with, this is the way the world should be, A, B, C, and D, and say, and this is the way the world is? So what I'm getting at is, part of my work when I was working with the Spokane Alliance and community organizing was trying to get at those very questions of, this is the way the world is, and this is the way we think the world should be. And that work in community-based organizing is always understanding self-interest, and to understand, we can't deny people's self-interest, and people are going to want to feed their own families. But if there's a way to feed their own family and feed your family too, just about everyone is going to say, absolutely. And so be honest, I mean, about those questions, and to realize, everything takes some give and take.
Looking at the time, I think one of the things I'd like to come back to is the interesting role that churches take when it comes to politics. Some churches are so bold as to tell you exactly who to vote for. We operate in a theoretical separation of church and state. And I find myself thinking that, if you looked at, I think it's an unanswerable question I posed at the beginning, which is, who would Jesus vote for?
Yeah.
I think he would say that's not the right question.
Yeah.
And so I find myself thinking that maybe what the opportunity for churches is to cultivate the spiritual and the philosophical part of a person's life in order to be able to come back together in communion with one another to solve these problems.
Well, it's right. It's if we are standing up there, my daughter had posted something on Facebook and got into a pretty good conversation. I think with one it was a person that was struggling, being pro-life, and her faith, teaching be pro-life, but why she probably was not going to vote for President Trump, and to say it's because of how complicated all these issues are. And it was suddenly this acknowledgement. So it seems to me, the tradition I'm in from, and what I've said both when I was pastor at St. Mark's, and will say it as I'm a pastor now at United Lutheran Church in Eugene, is we don't want you to check your brain at the door, because we think the brains that God gave us are to be used for conversation, for looking about how we lift up the least of these, how we love our neighbor, how we do good even to those who persecute us. And so to keep bringing people back into conversation. So you asked that question, is the place, it's hard. It is a very hard question to ask, because there is a good segment of the church, if I'm using the whole universal church, that has chosen a couple things, and everything else falls in place, that God must be ordaining President Trump, and because you're going to get conservative judges, and you're going to, and we're going to be able to deal with that. We're going to be able to protect babies' lives, right? And to my tradition, which has tended to have both liberal and conservative in, is are we going to be locked into going a certain direction to be that corrective as a church, instead of inviting people back? So I want to be able to name evil where I see evil. And there are certain things about this current administration that I would just say are plain evil, and I need to be able to speak about that. But I also need, what would be ideal is to say, somebody, instead of saying, we don't want you to be political from the pulpit, to come back to me and say, here's where I take issue with it, and let's have a conversation about this. And then for me to go back the next week and go, I was, I misspoke because I learned something new from this conversation. But we don't have those avenues. So what's the church's role? It is to promote, I think, still these questions, these ethical, philosophical, faith, spiritual questions, to say, what's holding you in fear? What brings out the best of you to love your neighbor? What is promoting that to love your neighbor? What meaning is your faith driving you towards, to get back, to that whole purpose question that we're in? And yeah, so I think, and to wrestle with that, and to say, and forgive, be very ready to forgive one another as we go through this, this process, because sometimes our emotions are going to get ahead of our thoughts. Sometimes we need more emotion, and that's why forgiveness is gone. But if we can all come back to the fact to say, and they are a child of God too. It's going to take us a long ways. So that's
well, and you mentioned the two big points of debate that stop the big conversation stoppers,
right.
Abortion rights and guns.
Yep.
And what's interesting to me is if you were to pull back from either one of those towards the center and dealt with the issues that end up leading to those choices, if you dealt with safety, if you dealt with health and well-being, if you dealt with childhood, if you dealt with sex education, if you dealt with the causes rather than the outcomes, I think it would be a more interesting conversation. I remember listening to Jesse Jackson saying, if we just took care of the babies that were here, we probably wouldn't be faced with the demand for abortion of unwanted babies. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, I think the question's the wrong question.
Yeah. You're right. Now, and I think that's a good way that, the response that my daughter got on that was, again, it's interesting. It came to some of these personal liberties. I don't want the schools teaching my kids what to do. I don't want, and which my daughter responded is to say, you are a good parent. And if you feel uncomfortable with what the schools are teaching with sex education, you do have the right to opt out. That is part of it. But we have so many kids that don't have that parental role models in their lives that can talk their kids and share the values, that the misinformation causes the very problems that you're talking about. And I think it gets lost. It gets lost in that, back to what we were talking about, that personal liberty question. Don't take my guns away, right? It's my personal liberty. And yet most of the people that I know that are gun rights told that they don't want the person that's half cocked to have guns. No pun intended. But they would say that mental illness, boy, we've got to be very careful there, and let's have that conversation. And what are those responsible? But we get into this all or nothing mindset.
Well, and can we have the same liberties in a urban environment that you have in a rural environment?
Right. No.
Does one size fit all?
Right.
Yeah. Clearly not.
Yeah. No. And we're seeing that over and over again.
Well, I think it's been a good conversation. Thank you.
Let me end with one question to you, Ira. What would you like to see from your church when it came to politics and these conversations? What do you think would be helpful?
I'm going to answer that by saying I'm going to share something that Robert Frost said about poetry. He said it was the job of the he said it was the job of the poet to climb sufficiently high up that the opposites become two legs of the same stool. And I think that the role of church, the Spirit of God is rarely found in its words, but it's felt through intimation of ritual, through prayer, and through parables and stories that address these bigger questions. So to me, I tend to want the spirit to be worked on in a non-partisan way, so that we can all climb up out of the darkness that we're in right now with the just very, very harsh debate. I think that we need to, the role of church is to challenge us to be our best selves, and to be loving, compassionate, and self-reliant, and caring. Like it embodies both without having to embody politics.
Good, thanks. Okay. I will take that to heart. And
well, I mean, it'd be worth having another conversation about just the origins of fundamentalism and the origins of the kind of evangelism that is black and white. Kind of interesting to look at that and say where did religion move in that direction? Was it always that way? But I think that's a topic for another time. But I think just asking these questions is worthwhile.
Yep, absolutely. So, thanks, Ira.
Hey, thank you.
Thank you for joining us today on The Spiritual Hedgehog. For show notes and more information, go to www.thespiritualhedgehog.com.